Check. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay. In this session, I want to focus on leadership, which is really the theme of this conference. And I have basically 3 chapters that I've done in the book on that subject, chapters 18, 19, and 20. Chapter 18 deals with what I call leadership in the church phase 1. And I see phase 1 being described by Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, where Paul wrote, "And he, Jesus, gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers." And then he spells out their function: to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And as I understand the unfolding story in Scripture, as you read through the book of Acts actually focuses on the function of these leaders that Paul just spelled out in retrospect: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. Very little reference to local church leadership and how it functions, except brief references to the appointment. For example, on the first missionary journey, when Paul and Barnabas returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia, they appointed elders in every church. And then Paul goes on back to Antioch, starts the next journey, and so forth. Phase 2, however, and that I call leadership in the church phase 2, involves permanent leaders in local churches. You really don't have that much descriptive information in the book of Acts. Most of what you learn about phase 2, elders and leaders and deacons, you'll learn from the epistles, particularly 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1. In this session, I want to focus on phase 2. And by the way, these 2 phases are really, interestingly, for me, in my research, are affirmed by the church fathers. And I deal with this under the lens of history, where I have a chapter entitled Leadership Lessons from Church History. And in that chapter, what I do is I take you into the Didache, which was written somewhere around the turn of the century. Not by the apostles, but they're not quite sure who wrote the Didache, but these 2 phases are clear. You have the apostles, prophets, and teachers. They use that terminology like it was used in 1 Corinthians. You had apostles, prophets. The Spirit gave some apostles, prophets, teachers. In Ephesians 4, Paul elaborates: apostles, prophets, and then he inserts evangelists, and then pastors and teachers. And so basically, you'll have a reference to those 3 phases. You also have a reference to those, 2 phases. Clement of Rome. I do a significant section looking at what Clement of Rome wrote, and again, you see these 2 phases. Where you really begin to see some of that is in Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, in his 7 letters. And you learn some tremendous lessons, because these are the church fathers writing, following the inspiration of Scripture, what we have in the New Testament. All I'm saying is you'll find it fascinating to study how those two phases functioned and operated following the biblical story. And one of the major problems they had was with false apostles and false prophets and false teachers. And you see that happening immediately following the first century. In fact, it began, of course, in the New Testament, because you have Paul referring to false apostles and prophets and teachers. But you see a clear distinction between these, what I call the greater gifts, really what Paul called the greater gifts, these initial phase 1 leaders and phase 2 leaders. You see a unique difference between them. By the way, one of the most significant differences, and to me, this is a very significant observation in terms of hermeneutics, and to me resolves a lot of issues in terms of leadership when you understand that Paul said Jesus gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. But when you get into phase 2, what you have is a freedom for anyone, not some, anyone who desires to be an elder, a deacon, is free to seek that position. Only they must be mature. So the uniqueness there is that there's a difference between Jesus sovereignly giving some to be, and then open-endedly saying, if you want to be a spiritual leader in the local church, it's open-ended. Just be mature. If you take that hermeneutic principle, it'll explain a lot of things, I think, in relationship. And I just suggest that I do quite a bit of in-depth study on that in those chapters. And I won't go into that anymore today, but to me, it's one of the most fascinating things in resolving a lot of issues in terms of interpretation, particularly in terms of pastors and teachers, because it says he gave some to be pastors and teachers, but in the local church, an elder is a pastor and teacher, but it's a freedom. It doesn't say the Lord gave it. What it says is you have a choice to be that. There's a unique difference there. And once you understand that, it really helps, I think, to put some things together in the unfolding story of the church. So you'll be interested in taking a look at that and seeing what I do with it. Now, in terms of phase 2, I'm going to focus in on chapter 20, because in chapter 20, what I do is I list a number of supercultural principles of leadership based on both phase 1 and phase 2. But focusing particularly on phase 2 because that's where most of us live. Most of us live in local communities, leading churches. And so the relevancy there relates to elders particularly. So, to me, the most neglected principle throughout church history is this principle, that all elders, or let's broaden it, let's say all spiritual leaders, should be appointed based on the maturity profile outlined by Paul in the pastoral epistles. Now, let me state that again, because that's a mouthful, not only in words, but in concept. And also, you might say, in terms of reliability, is it a true statement? Most neglected principle throughout church history is this principle that all elders or spiritual leaders should be appointed based on the maturity profile outlined by Paul in the pastoral epistles. Now, to check myself on that, I met with a guy that I think is a great church historian, and that's Dr. John Hanna. I consider him a mentor. He's a fellow professor at Dallas when we were both there on faculty, and he's written on the subject. And I had lunch with John, and I said, John, first of all, I shared with him what I was researching, and I submitted this chapter that I have in this historical section for his review. And I was so thankful. He gave me some great pointers. But generally, he said he agreed with what I shared, what I'd found. And that was reassuring to me because I believe it's important to do theology in community. I think one of the most dangerous things is to do a theology in isolation. It's a violation of a biblical principle that every joint should supply in building up the body, and that applies to doing biblical research. But then I said, John, tell me if this is correct. The question was, where in church history, all of church history, do you have a strong emphasis on these qualities? And he paused, and then he said, I can't remember any. And he's a student of church history. Now, he did refer to Calvin in Calvin's exposition of 1 Timothy and Titus, particularly 1 Timothy. He makes reference to them, but very little emphasis on being qualified to lead the church. So what I'd like to do is to share with you some lessons I've learned, some painful lessons in relationship to this principle. Because I think it is the most significant principle in terms of creating a mature church, is have models of godliness in both husband and wives, men and women who serve as spiritual leaders in the church. And if that principle is neglected, it leads to all kinds of problems. And to set the stage, what I'd like to do is share with you the video that I did to introduce chapter 23. Now video 23 to introduce chapter 20, which is the chapter I have on principles of leadership. The principles of leadership now are based on the research, as you'll see in the first chapter where I deal with that in chapter 18, and then local church leadership, chapter 19, and then based on these two chapters, principles that grow out of both of those phases. So let me introduce you to what I'd like to say by sharing with you what I did just recently in putting together this video to introduce this particular chapter. So here it is. As we study and reflect on leadership in the New Testament story, both in phase 1 and phase 2, we once again discover supracultural principles which can and should be applied wherever churches are planted and established. If these principles are stated correctly and applied effectively, they'll enable us to become churches that are growing in faith, hope, and love. As I reflect back on my years as a church planning pastor, without question, my greatest learning experience relates to leadership. I've discovered how important it is to make sure that those who lead the church reflect the life of Jesus Christ, as measured by the qualifications outlined by the Apostle Paul in his letters to Timothy and Titus. This indeed is a supercultural principle. As I share in this particular chapter, I definitely took this list of qualifications seriously when we launched the First Fellowship Bible Church. In fact, I believe it's impossible to ignore this function and principle when we've carefully and objectively studied the unfolding story in the book of Acts, as well as in Paul's example and his directives in his letters. And the Apostle Peter certainly adds to what biblical eldership should look like when, as a leader of the apostles, he humbly identified himself as a fellow elder with those who managed and shepherded local churches. Listen once again to what he wrote shortly before he probably faced martyrdom in Rome. Shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not out of greed for money, but eagerly, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. Peter, of course, learned this lesson directly from Jesus Christ when, as the Lord of the universe, he washed the apostles' feet and then asked and answered a very sobering question. Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done for you. Well, again, without question, the qualifications for spiritual leaders in the church are very clear and important in the unfolding biblical story. However, in terms of leadership, here's the greatest lesson I've learned. In order to help men and women evaluate the degree to which they measure up to these qualifications, we need a comprehensive methodology. I discovered it's not enough to just ask prospective leaders to read these qualifications and even to reflect on them in light of their present experiences. But here's another significant lesson I've learned. Just because someone is talented and gifted and is even very successful in other arenas, for example, in business, it's not in itself a true measure of maturity, as outlined by Paul. If talent and ability become the primary criteria, it can lead to serious dysfunction and disunity in the leadership team. In fact, a powerful, talented person who is immature spiritually can create problems that are almost insurmountable. Unfortunately, I've seen that happen in my own pastoral ministry, and it was a devastating experience for me, my family, and the whole church. Now, this doesn't mean spiritual leaders should lack special talents and skills. However, when this becomes the basic criteria without carefully considering biblical qualifications, they can lead to divisiveness among the leaders, which in turn can affect the unity in the whole church. Well, in this chapter, I've shared 7 supercultural principles of church leadership. And as I've already emphasized and illustrated, one of the most important principles relates to specific qualifications for serving in this role. I'll also share how over the years I became much more effective in practicing this principle. And remember, as primary pastoral leaders, we should practice this principle in our own lives and model these qualities to both present and prospective leaders. And one last thing. As you think about your own church experience, what principles are being practiced effectively? But on the other hand, what principles could be practiced more effectively? And What could make this happen? So basically, that's designed to take the reader into that chapter to look at, all the principles, but especially to look at this whole area. And by the way, I have to share something funny. As I was watching, and you may not have noticed this, but I happened to be born and reared in Indiana. And in Indiana, we wash clothes. And in that quotation from Scripture, I noticed that I slipped on a couple of those. Usually my tech guy, David, and here's another one of my tech guy, picks this up where I'll say wash. I just regress to that rather than saying wash. And I don't know if you noticed, but in that in that particular quotation, I regressed at one point. I started out, I had it right, wash their feet, and then later I said wash. So anyway, I couldn't help but be amused at myself on that particular one. But on a very serious note, towards the end of that, I said that as spiritual leaders, pastors, ministers, whatever we're called, if we're elders, we're shepherds. That's one of our qualifications. Whether we're a lead shepherd, lead elder, lead support people, whatever, we're to be qualified because we're to model what it means to be a Christ-like person in our personal life, in our marriages, in our families, and so forth. And, one of the great tragedies has hit right now in terms of the scandals. And Dallas, Texas is the focus of some of the major scandals of some of very key leaders that have been guilty of immorality and have fallen. And I mean, it's hurt the church. And that's another reason some people have said, I love Jesus and I hate the church. They overreact to that. And so more than ever, I think we're faced with the importance, particularly that second quality of being a man of one woman, a woman of one man, in terms of what it means to be a spiritual leader. And boy, we've got to take that seriously. I mean, because it's hurting the Church of Jesus Christ, sadly, among some of the top well-known leaders. And that's a scandal within the world. And so anyway, as I reflected on what I said just at the end of that video, that, boy, that's relevant right now. And has been, of course, throughout the centuries, but certainly within the evangelical movement. Now, what I'd like you to do to develop this concept, and let me just simply, to segue into what I want to do here, to me, the greater gifts, or phase one, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, and there, by the way, just so you understand, I put Timothy and Titus in there as being those who were called, not just by Paul, but by the Holy Spirit, among those that Jesus gave some to be. So they were unique pastors, teachers. They weren't permanent. They helped to establish the church in Ephesus, the churches in Crete. They were called to appoint elders within the church. And to me, those are the pastors and teachers that Paul was referring to in Ephesians chapter 4. And as a result of the gift of those greater gifts, they were to equip the saints, that's all of us, for the work of ministry. And there's two categories of saints. There are those that are saints generally, and then there are those saints that lead. And we're among the saints that lead. So these gifts were given by the Lord to equip us in a special way for the work of ministry until we reach the stature of the fullness of Christ. So with that in mind, if you'll turn to page 281, and I want to share with you basically some lessons that I have learned in my years as a church planter. On page 280, I've stated that principle that all leaders should be appointed based on the maturity profile outlined by Paul in the pastoral epistles. And here, by the way, I just simply share what led me to write The Measure of a Man. That's that dynamic Bible study. And as a result of that, unexpectedly, this book became a very key book in helping to equip men and their wives, particularly, to become spiritual leaders in the church. And I'm thankful for that. And to me, it is so foundational. And as I said in my meeting with John, I said, John, you know, in church history, where do you have a strong emphasis on developing spiritual leaders based on those qualities? And that's when he paused and says, I can't remember. And he knows church history. Now, basically, when you get into Ignatius, particularly, and you see what happened in the second century, and I'm very sympathetic because these individuals, these church fathers, were trying to keep things together because false prophets were emerging all over the place. And what happened is, I think inadvertently, it led to a hierarchy in relationship to leadership. And in that hierarchy, it ultimately led to what happened in Rome, and ultimately led to the Pope, and ultimately led to Roman Catholicism, which ultimately led to what we now know is some serious problems within Romanism, let alone Protestantism. And even in the Reformation, there was that just strong emphasis on the authority of Scripture, which was wonderful. We needed that. The authority of justification by faith, which we needed because it was works up to that point. A strong emphasis on these great truths. But even in Lutheranism, and even within the Protestant reformers, you do not have a strong emphasis on making sure that local church leaders are qualified according to what Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. And to me, that's key. It's a key element that is missing, and something that we've got to recapture within our churches, because it is so biblically important. And you'll notice that what I do on page 281, this represents a scale that we developed towards the end of when I was pastoring my pastoral leadership baton. We refined this after several years. And what we did is, where any individual that was open to eldership, and I'll share more how we did that just a little bit later, but we asked people who knew these people to evaluate both husband and wife in this case. How do you evaluate his or her reputation as a Christian, both among fellow believers as well as among non-Christians? That is so clear in that list. At the beginning of the list, at the end of the list. In other words, a spiritual leader is supposed to have a reputation within the church and without. That's the way the list ends in 1 Timothy 3. Among unbelievers. How do you evaluate his or her relationship with his or her spouse, namely moral purity? Because I believe that's what a man of one woman, measure of a woman, or a measure of a man, husband of one wife, just basically means a man of one woman. Only one woman in your life. Your wife. That's what Paul was talking about. Temperate. How do you evaluate the degree to which he or she is maintaining balance in his or her Christian experience? And I spell that out in the measure of a man, what that actually balance looks like. How do you evaluate his or her ability to be wise and discerning? How satisfied are you with the way his or her life reflects the life of Jesus Christ and being respectable? How do you evaluate his or her life level of generosity? These are all listed by Paul. I mean, this is not just, these are not my words. These are Paul's words from the Holy Spirit. I mean, generosity. I'm talking about those qualities, not the statements, obviously. To what degree are you satisfied with his or her ability to control various kinds of obsessions and compulsions? That's the addictive aspect. How satisfied are you with his or her ability to relate to other people without being self-centered and controlling? Those are statements. How satisfied are you with the way he or she handles anger? Not all anger is sin, obviously. How do you handle it? How satisfied are you with his or her ability to control any form of verbal or physical abuse? Well, that's pugnacious, you know. How objective and fair-minded is her relationship with others? That's really what gentle means there. It's a special kind of gentleness. How satisfied are you with his or her ability to avoid arguments, being uncontentious? How satisfied are you with his or her ability to be non-materialistic, not being a lover of money? If they're a father or mother, how satisfied are you with his or her ability to function this role according to God's plan? That's not perfection, obviously. That'd disqualify all of us if it were. To what degree are you satisfied with his or her efforts at overcoming evil with good? Loving what is good is a quality. How satisfied are you with his or her ability to be just and fair in his or her relationship with others? Just, upright. To what degree are you satisfied with the way his or her life reflects God's holiness? That's what the word devout means, holy. How satisfied are you with his or her ability to live a disciplined Christian life? Paul mentions that particularly in Titus, discipline. And then overall, how do you evaluate his or her overall maturity as a Christian? Now, notice what I say here. I have what I call pastoral reflections. After 50 years involved in church planting, I'm convinced that selecting and appointing elders and wives, if married, based on this maturity profile is absolutely essential to become the church God intended us to be. And by the time I was in process of passing my leadership baton to my successor as lead pastor, we had arrived at the following methodology. And I passed my baton, by the way, 20 years ago. And I just talked with my successor recently, and he said, Gene, we follow the same process because we developed this together. Now, here's what we did. Now, understand, I'm going to share based on a form that we developed. There's nothing sacred about our form, okay? And you need to understand the form to understand the process that we went through. But still, the process, I think, is relevant to any form that we develop. So number one, as elders, in consultation with our wives, and to me that's a very important thing, we discussed potential candidates. Couples we felt measured up to the biblical qualifications and who had faithfully served as small group leaders for a significant period of time. Now understand, this is after we had established a church, so we already had mature elders in place. If you're just starting from scratch, then you have to think in terms of a new form to be able to do this. But once we had established an eldership of maturity, we did not go to the church and say, who do you want as an elder? Because that can be devastating. Because the average person out there has no clue of what I've just read to you in those 20 qualities. It will be a popularity contest. And if it is, you open the door to serious problems. That form is out of harmony with biblical function. Okay. So we found that what we did is that we considered people that had served faithfully already with people. That's where we started. Then what we did is after we came up with several couples, we gave an invitation to evaluation. And we narrowed the list, we approached these couples, explained why we'd chosen them. We asked them, would they be open to go through a process? And then we described the whole process so that they were wide open, they understood the process. And the process are the next steps. In other words, here's the process that we explained to them that would happen. The first step in the process, step 3, was to study the biblical qualifications. And to do that, we asked these prospective couples to meet with the lead pastor or minister and his wife to spend a number of weeks studying these 20 qualities. Now, in our particular case, we used the measure of a man. And to actually, at the point where I was transitioning, my successor and his wife, before he became my replacement, met with these couples and spent a number of weeks going through these qualities in depth to understand what they really mean. So that was step number 1. Are you willing to go through that process? In other words, we didn't just simply say, would you read these qualities and tell us if you measure up? I have to be honest, that's where I started, 50 years ago. And I soon found out that didn't work. Because we appointed people to eldership that never should have been appointed to eldership. They weren't being deceptive. They thought they were qualified. But they didn't understand what those qualities really meant. And by the way, one of the worst things we can do is to put a couple into leadership where there are cracks in their marriage. And the fact is, you may not discover cracks in the marriage until they've been in ministry for a period of time. And that's why we found it so important to choose couples that had actually been in ministry for a period of time. I remember one couple, and by the way, my wife had a lot more savvy than I did, very intuitive. And one particular couple, she said, Gene, do you think that couple is mature enough? And I said, yeah, they read the qualities. They think they're mature enough. she had the intuitiveness to see a crack in that marriage we didn't, as men, we didn't see. And sure enough, boy, they got in a ministry, hit the fan, and got a divorce. We set them up for a divorce, I'm convinced. Now, I don't want to overblame myself, but I sometimes wonder if we hadn't put them in leadership, whether they got... It set them up because Satan attacked them in an unusual way. So that's why, I learned it's very important to think that through. So that's the step or the process. Then step 4 in this, and I love this because my successor came up with this idea. At the end of this evaluation process, the lead pastor, who is my successor, spent several days with these prospective elders, the men, along with several current elders, in this case men, in a wilderness setting, in our case, a scheduled ranch in Big Bend country of Texas. And here they had opportunity to get to know each other at a deeper level, studying the Word together, praying together, sharing together, spending time recreationally. And what happened is, not only did these prospective elder men go into this wilderness experience, but there were about 3 other seasoned elders that went with them to explain what it means to be an elder, to share out of their own life experience, as an elder. Now, by the way, all of this is giving these people an opportunity to say no. And we let them know up front, this is not embarrassment. If you want to bail, and we didn't use that word, but in a sense, if you want out of the process at any moment, you're free. Because as elders, we're the only ones that know you're even in this process. And our hats are off to you if you say, I really don't feel I'm ready for this. And we gave them that opportunity. So that was the deeper relational experience. And by the way, make sure you don't appoint an elder who's non-relational, because shepherding is relational. You've got to see that develop, that quality develop in people. Relational. I think that's biblical, okay? Jesus was very relational, okay? Step number 5 was evaluating the candidates. Our next step was to use the character qualities to evaluate both husband and wife candidates. Now, at this point, the evaluation process hasn't even set in. They've been evaluating themselves, but they're not being evaluated at this point by anybody else. Except as elders, we invited them into the process because we thought they were ready. Okay? So our next step was to use the character qualities to evaluate both husband and wife candidates. And the following church leaders filled out the evaluation form. Now, the evaluation form is what I just read to you. Okay? The current elders and their wives used that, read that, filled out an evaluation form. As elders and wives, what do we think of this couple? By the way, for an elder and a wife to go through that process, you got to look at yourself. I mean, if you're going to be evaluating somebody else based on these qualities, it's always a process. And by the way, when we went through this process with these, for example, when my successor led them through this process with his wife, he didn't say, we're going to teach you. What they said is, we're going to go through this process with you. We're going to look at our own lives. And every time I've taken people through this, I've said, I'm going to look at my own life. We're going to look at our own lives. And every time I go through that process, by the way, I say, hey, I'm still in process here. There are changes I can make. And that's very important when you sit down with someone and go through this process, is you're not teaching them, you're learning, you're growing, you're leading them through a process. So the current elders and their wives filled out the evaluation forms that we just read. We asked our senior staff people who knew these couples well. Now, obviously, at this point, our church was a large church. So you have to adapt this in terms of, the extent, the size of your church. And then the people who were part of the small group, who knew these couples the best? Not us as elders. It was the people they had led for a couple of years. And so very openly, and these couples knew all about this process before they even said they would go through it. We'd say, we're going to ask your small group to evaluate you based on these qualities. And by the way, if a person is willing to take that step, they're a long way down the road in terms of revealing their maturity. Okay? Now, I have to say, by the way, in our church at that point, we were large. We had about 75 evaluation forms on each, husband and wife. And then once we looked through that list, and by the way, by that time, they passed almost 100%, if they were willing to go this far. But I remember one situation where one man, Eddie, he's now with Jesus. By the way, at my age, I've had the privilege of conducting funerals for 4 of my key elders. 4 guys and their wives. Wonderful, godly people that I served with for a long time. I love those guys, boy. We were very close. Wonderful women, too. Wives, supportive, boy. But anyway, then we had the final invitation. And once the elders had assessed all of these evaluations, and there was one guy, Eddie, now with Jesus, laid him to rest. He flunked on about 3 of them, 4 or 5 of them. He was marked down consistently in being what would be contentious or somewhat operating like a bully, insensitive. And I had, with another elder, the challenge to sit down with Eddie and his wife. And by the way, his wife had perfect scores. And she's sitting here, and this elder and I took the lead. I said, Eddie, according to these evaluations, consistently you're marked down in these areas. And he just listened. And it's really interesting, on the way home in the car, he asked his wife, he said, Maureen, what do you think? And she said, Eddie, I've been trying to tell you that for 20 years. And he went home and he got all of his kids together. And he had a chart, and he put it on the refrigerator. And he had all these points where he was marked down. And he said, every time I'm insensitive, I violate these, I want you to give me a check. And he said, I got 5 checks the first night. And he said, initially when I got this news from the elders, he said, I was embarrassed. I wanted to leave the church. And then he said, I said, no, That's not the deal. In essence, this is my opportunity to grow. For 2 years, I saw him grow. I met with him, encouraged him. He got involved in different ministries other than eldership. And eventually he became an elder. And he was one of our best. And I remember that when I conducted his funeral, I played a videotape where he himself personally shared the story for all those who had gathered there for his celebration of his life. So I've seen some really significant things happen with this process. But in general, the final invitation, people have either said, no, I don't want to proceed, or they're willing, step by step, to move forward. And then after that, we presented them to the congregation. And when we presented them to the total congregation, I did a message. I had to succinctly give a message on all these qualities. And we shared with the whole congregation the process they'd gone through. And you can imagine the respect that is building, that anyone that was willing to go through that process to become a spiritual leader in the church. I mean, it was a great tribute to these couples already. And so we presented them, but then here's something we did. And this, of course, basically, I'm discussing form. It's a process, and wherever you have function, you have form. So this is the form we developed. But at the end of the presentation, we said, now, if you're here for the first time today, and you know this couple, and we don't, you know something about this couple that violates these qualities, we want to hear from you. Now, why did we say that? Because they're to have a good reputation with those without. Paul said that. I didn't. So we said, if you're not even a part of this church, we want to hear. If you have something to say to us or within the church. And then we said, we want to hear from you by Wednesday in writing. But you got to sign it, because if you don't sign it, we won't read it. Okay? And then we said, we want you to sign it because this couple wants to talk to you about your concerns. Because if there's something in their lives that is not in harmony and you've got a question, they want to correct it. Can you imagine? Wow, it worked. As I recall, we didn't get any written communication. Because everybody said, generally, if they're willing to go through that kind of process to become a spiritual leader in this church, who are we to have concerns? Because our perceptions are probably wrong. Because they've gone, we shared with the congregation everything they'd gone through. And then we had a public commissioning. There were no reservations. We presented these couples to the total church body. And all the elders and wives laid their hands on them, prayed for them. And I just add a note there. I say, once we instituted this very thorough process, we had virtually no concerns expressed. And that's predictable, isn't it? But boy, the process was a great process and learning experience that we went through. So what I said in the video is that when I first started this church planting, that I just simply asked prospective elders and leaders to read these qualities and evaluate themselves. But I discovered through the process over the years, they weren't being dishonest. They just didn't even understand what the qualities meant. And they didn't even know whether they were qualified. Now, this is not perfection. I mean, I think any one of you in this room can read through that list and you can say yes or no. Just that simple, once you understand it. Most of it say yes, but I'm still in process. But it's once you understand those qualities, which we try to spell out in Measure of Man, it's easy to say yes or no. No, I'm not there yet. Like Eddie, once he really understood, he said, no, I am not qualified in this area. I've got to make changes. And he did. So I just wanted to share with you where I ended, in a sense, my church planting ministry past my leadership baton. And we developed this. This was something we developed over a process of 20, 25 years of refining this process in order to appoint elders and leaders that were really mature in Jesus Christ, according to what Paul was saying. And we learned a lot in the process, obviously. But it was an exciting journey. And I'm thrilled to know that my successor is still working with this process in the appointment of new elders. Now, that's based on our system in terms of eldership. You can take the process and say, okay, how does that fit our structure? How does it fit starting a new church? And let me tell you, don't appoint elder to have an elder. If you don't have qualified people, don't appoint them. I think there's a mistake at times. You say, well, we're a church and we're supposed to have elders. Not until they're qualified. I don't think there are any elders in Corinth for the first 3 years. If there were, Paul would have made reference to them in the letter. And there's no reference. Now, in the letter, the Corinthian letter that was written after 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which is not in the canon of Scripture, it does refer to elders in the church in Corinth. But Paul did not appoint elders in Corinth. I don't believe they're not there because there wasn't anyone qualified to be one. So that's a very important point. You don't appoint elders just to have elders. You appoint elders to have qualified spiritual leaders in the church. Now, there's some relativity here, obviously, in all of this. I think there's some relativity even in those qualities, based on situations. But generally speaking, once you understand the definition of those qualities, which we try to do in the Measure of Man, it's pretty clear what they mean. And most people will understand it. They'll absolutely understand it. So I just wanted to share with you that process. As I said, it's probably one of the greatest learning experiences I had in my whole life in church planting. And we planted, just in the Dallas area alone, we planted about 12 churches. I pastored 3 of them myself as senior leader. But it was a great experience and growth experience. I alluded to this in the video. If you select an individual who is talented, successful in business, charismatic, but who doesn't measure up to these qualities, he can destroy the church. All it takes is one. Just one. And they may be sincere in thinking they're qualified, but you can have a brilliant businessman, very successful, multimillionaire, who's immature biblically. And once they go through this process, they'll understand that. And you'll find out. So to me, I would say this is the most important principle in leadership, and it's probably one of my greatest lessons that I've learned personally over a process of time. And it's been a great journey in that sense. Okay, I've kind of unloaded here, but any comments, questions? Yes, sir.
I got two.
All right.
One, in the book, all of the...
Wait until you get the mic so everybody can hear you. I think probably, are you recording these? Okay, yeah, wait for get a mic.
In the book, you have all these surveys and stuff here. Are those available to print anywhere?
Yeah, they're actually, yeah, and take that one, copy that one.
Just copy it up. But
Just
it's like
copy
on
it.
the back where you were printing off, there's not like the QR code to scan that at all, right?
In my book, Elders and Leaders, we didn't bring any of those, but I have a book, Elders and Leaders. It's in the back of that book.
Okay, excellent. And then my other one was you'd mentioned in the video and kind of again here about somebody who gets in and so it sounded like you had a specific story. Would you tell us what happened with the guy that you had, that the elder that you got in there that wasn't good?
Oh, you mean the one that got a divorce?
No, the one. Well, I don't know. You mentioned the one that you had a guy that came in and like an immature elder, and just how devastating that can be in the church.
Yeah.
Would you tell us that story,
yeah,
please?
Yeah, I had several of those. One individual was so carnal that we discovered later on that he had immorality in his life. We found out that he was fired from another counseling ministry because of immorality. He was manipulative. He came across, he had me fooled. And ultimately, he had such a powerful influence on my successor in one of the churches that he literally destroyed this man. And this pastor, became guilty of rape, went to prison because of that man. And it destroyed the church. It hurt the church terribly. And I was totally deceived by him. And found out later that, he was actually ultimately fired from a high-level position in a seminary because of immorality, lying, alcoholism, and bad principles of teaching and communication. He was fired. And he was right under my nose. And I didn't see those things. That's one of the worst ones that ever happened. Because what happened is he influenced a number of others and led to their downfall. So that's an extreme case, obviously. Very extreme. By the way, that pastor that went to prison, we stayed in contact with him, and he came out of prison after serving, I think, 25 years. And once he came out, there were several of us. He had to wear in fact, he's listed as a sex offender right now on the web, if you knew his name. But he went through a conversion, repentance when he was in prison. And when he got out, one of our pastors in another church that we started took him under his wing and began to help him. He, of course, went through a divorce. Then he remarried. He actually married the librarian at this prison who was not she was not an inmate. And she retired. He got to know her in prison, and they were married. She's a believer. But after a period of time, he asked this other pastor that he was working with, that he said, I want to confess publicly and ask Jean to forgive me. And the pastor called me and said, would you be a part of that? And I said, I'd love to be a part. So in this church, 3 services, and he got up, acknowledged what he had done, and asked me for forgiveness in front of this several thousand people. And I said, I forgive you. I forgave you a long time ago. I said, you hurt a lot of people, but I'm so glad you're repentant. And there was an invitation given after that service. They had a prayer rail. And every service, that prayer rail was filled with people. And the irony on that is a woman came up to my wife and me after the 3rd service. And she said, do you remember me? And we said, yeah, we called her by name. She was divorced. And her husband was the guy that I told you about. That very deceptive elder. And she was walking with the Lord. And so we had a reunion right there after several years. So, yeah, that was a really tough experience. I learned an awful lot through that experience. Painful. Really painful. But, you know, out of pain you grow. Well, I think our time's about up.
We got another question here, Gene.
Question.
I had 2 related to what you said. One, on the business side, where you can have a guy come in because he's successful in life. How often has it been your experience to see someone be overlooked as an elder because they did not have the financial standing that we often tend to be attracted to as an elder?
Restate that. I'm not tracking exactly what.
Okay. How many elders did you have that were poor? Because we warn about not looking at people because of their success, but how many do we overlook because they don't have that success, who are probably
Oh,
qualified?
yeah, I think I'm tracking with you. We didn't have any elders that were poor, but we did have elders that was at different levels,
Mhm.
you know. Yeah, I think we overlook people like that, probably. That's a cultural issue that needs to be dealt with in a spiritual dimension.
Yeah, it almost seems like we still believe in a prosperity gospel for our leaders.
Yeah.
Not,
yeah.
you know.
That's
But the second question I had was
a
in
very
relation.
good insight, and you've made your point.
Oh,
That's good.
no, well, and I don't know that I'm trying to, but the second one I had was, especially in light of the sexual abuse that's gone on for years and decades and centuries and however long. You had mentioned the idea that someone has to put their name on something in writing, but there's a lot of people who have been the victims of sexual abuse who the last thing that they want is to be seen in the light of day because they're still working through those issues. How would you deal with the potential of a sexual abuse accusation? I mean, I'm thinking about just even in the last year, how many things have come up from decades ago, even from churches here in Texas, where past sexual abuse of 12-year-old girls and things like that came up after decades. How would you handle someone trying to anonymously make that kind of contact in some way to make a determination about whether or not a guy should be an elder? Do I need to restate that?
I'm coming close. I'm not, you need to
okay.
keep talking.
Uh,
Illustration, use an illustration.
Well, yeah, well, for instance, before you said that if someone says that they don't think someone should be an elder, they need to write a letter, sign their name to it. But if there's someone who is still coming to grips with a past sexual abuse, that they are not ready to be publicly seen or known in that way for that accusation, but they're still working through that, but they still want to communicate that anonymously, how would that factor into a determination, especially with how often it's happened?
Well, that's a good point, because I think that you could also modify that, and we didn't, but you could modify it to say that if you have some concern and you feel that you cannot express this in writing, as elders, we're open to talk with you, to come to you, to share anything you want to share. Yeah, that would be a good modification to do that. And by the way, since we're here, I'm going to share something with you to turn off the mics. I don't want this recorded.